What's up guys, Razio here again with another video, and today I'm bringing you an opinion piece, and it's a video I've been wanting to make for a while as the topic covered has been on my mind for years. Now, it's an opinion piece, like I said, so before you start making your fingertips bleed by raging in my comment section, I advise you to watch the whole video through. This will probably be a multi-part series, so this series is entitled, and again it's an opinion piece, How World of Warcraft's success has completely derailed the MMORPG genre. So, buckle up, get something to drink, and let's have a fucking good time.
I am Razio.
Alright, now before we start and get too deep into World of Warcraft itself or any of the other MMORPGs that are currently the reigning top MMORPGs of the genre today as of the year 2018, we need to take a step back in time. We need to, buckle up into our DeLoreans, hit 88 miles per hour, and, get that flux capacitor fucking going.
Great Scott!
And to do that, we need to take a look at the history of the MMO genre itself. What was it? How did it come to be? How did this genre even come to exist? Well, to understand that fully, we need to look at the grandfather of all fantasy games in general. The thing that started this concept of people being in worlds that are not of our own and being able to play with each other as a different character. And if you know anything about fantasy at all, you know where I'm headed with this. I am talking about the first game that really embraced the kind of freedom that we all seek in MMORPGs. And the game was first published in 1974 by Tactical Studies Rules Incorporated. It was later bought out by Wizards of the Coast, which I'm sure you all know, and that is, of course, Dungeons and Dragons. Now, D&D, Dungeons and Dragons, as I said earlier, came out in 1974. And if you're unfamiliar with Dungeons and Dragons, I'll give you a little bit of a background around the game. Pretty much, it was a game designed around choices and around the fantasy genre in general, where you would have one player of the game would be the DM, or Dungeon Master. And the Dungeon Master would create a campaign, a story, characters, locations, quests, everything. And then all the players that would play, which you could have a group as small as as small as 2 or 3 players, or you could have something as large as 20 players, though that got a little more complicated, would create characters based on the current version of Dungeons and Dragons rule sets, and pretty much go on an adventure together. And you could do anything. Your only limit was, of course, the rules of the current stats and the current classes that were built up in that current version of whatever version of Dungeons and Dragons you were playing, but all the other things were in the hands of the DM. So if you had a super creative DM, the imagination was the limit. And even if you had an unimaginative DM, Dungeons and Dragons enabled players to do anything they wanted in that world. Essentially, you could try to steal, you could try to have sex, you could try to pretty much do anything, and you would have to roll a set of dice to determine if you were successful and what kind of dice you could roll, to increase your odds. Obviously, if you need a 6 to succeed in a task, it's much easier to get a 6 rolling 2 6-sided die than it is rolling a single 20-sided die to get a 6. So obviously you would get the smaller die to increase your chances of things being successful if you were more proficient in what you were trying to do. So if your character was a ladies' man and you're trying to, get in the skirt of the barkeep's daughter, you'd obviously want to, you'd have a better chance than the ugly orc who's on your same team trying to do the same. Unless, of course, the DM had decided that particular chick, was into green dicks. But I digress. getting a little too much detail here. But D&D revolutionized gaming. I mean, you had teenagers playing, you had grown, men and women playing, you had younger kids, prepubescent kids playing the game. And it kind of almost became a phenomenon where people thought it was a cult, where people just didn't understand that really what it was just a bunch of nerds hanging out in a basement, eating pizza, drinking soda, and living out these fantasy lives as elves, dwarves, orcs, goblins, humans, what have you. And this game is really what spawned the whole idea of what if this could get bigger? What if more and more players could get involved, where we could live these second lives as these fantasy characters, these heroes or villains that we want to be? And that brings up another good point. In Dungeons and Dragons, the freedom was so great, you weren't guided on an on-rails path in every game you played of being the hero, the good guy. And in fact, even if you were the hero and the good guy, by the end, 90% of the non-player characters that the DM had thought up would have no idea you were the reason they were still alive that day. That you were the hero, you were the unsung hero. You weren't this guardian of light or champion of the light or whatever else that modern MMORPGs today really force on you as a character. You could be a villain, you could turn on your teammates, you could do so much. As I said, your imagination was the limit. So after D&D, where did it go from there? Well, realistically, people wanted D&D to get broader. And of course, in the 70s, mid to late 70s, the technology didn't exist for anything like this to be a possibility until I think it was early 1980s, late 70s, 1980s. Some college students started to design what was called a MUD, or a multi-user dimension. But initially, the first game that was completed wasn't long after D&D. It was in 1976, but it was still a single-player game because they just didn't have the network technology available to make a massive amount of users. I think in this original MUD, you could do 2 or 3 players, but you'd all be sitting on the same computer, and the DM would be an AI that would technically just followed a specific set of rules. So a lot of the Dungeons and Dragons freedom was kind of lost. However, by 78, 79, and 1980, the first MUD was created that was multi-user, and it was done over a college network because, again, at this point, internet didn't exist. So this multi-user dungeon or multi-user dimension, there's a lot of... The D is very interchangeable, ladies. But in a multi-user dungeon, the MUD, it started to become quite large in the early 80s to mid 80s to late 80s, when network connectivity was far more common. And pretty much what a MUD was it was a world you created that was 100% text-based. So it'd be the same as playing Dungeons and Dragons in the sense of the computer would tell you where you were, what your character was seeing, what your stats were, what your inventory was, what you were seeing. And then you would type commands of what you wanted to do, like go left, jump down the hole, attack this chicken, what the fuck have you. And then they started getting much more traction in the 90s when, the internet came about and things could get much more detailed. Moderators could sit in the MUDs and control the world a little more. But people wanted more. People wanted, what would it be like to step into a world in a graphical game, in a graphical MMORPG? And those didn't really come in any way, at any rate, in the way that we think of them. The third, over-the-shoulder, behind-your-character camera view 3D world didn't come to be until 1999 with EverQuest and Asheron's Call. Now, before I get deep into EverQuest and Asheron's Call, because they're kind of the first generation of true 3D MMOs, there were other MMOs that were graphical before that. To name a few, Tibia, Ultima Online, Meridian 59 came before EverQuest and Asheron's Call. But the reason why I don't count them to, and I'm not going to talk about them too terribly much, because they were 2D games, or in the example of like Tibia, Ultima Online, they were very RTS in style, 2D on overhead, looking from the sky down on your character, moving around. But they were the first iteration, and these games had their roots heavily dug into the Dungeons and Dragons mindset, the way the skills work, the classes, the characters, the freedom. Those were all as close to Dungeons and Dragons as you can get. Obviously, it's impossible to have limitless freedom in a video game the way you do in a board game or a pen and paper game like Dungeons and Dragons, but these games got insanely close. With EverQuest and Asheron's Call, though, which were released in 1999, both games were released in 1999, 9 months apart, we saw for the first time players were able to step into a 3D world and have endless freedom. Now, what made these games so successful? And when I'm talking about success, I'm not talking about these games having millions upon millions of subscribers, because that just was unheard of. The original MMO genre, when it was born with these games, when it was born with Ultima Online, Meridian 59, Tibia, Asheron's Call, EverQuest, it was aimed at the players that were obsessed with Dungeons and Dragons. It was aimed at getting these people, make these people's dreams a reality, make, these people that were so invested in these characters, because in games like Dungeons and Dragons, if you died, your character was just gone, especially if your DM was doing his job right. You tear up your character sheet and you start over the next game, you're dead. So obviously death penalties weren't as harsh in these games. In fact, a little known little tidbit of history here is during the development of EverQuest and Asheron's Call, Sierra Studios was creating Middle-earth Online, which did have permanent death, but it was going to be an over-the-top MMO, much like Ultima Online and Tibia and Meridian 59, and it got scrapped and abandoned. It was a game I was following pretty heavily in high school, and it got abandoned, and it was very disappointing because I loved Middle-earth and the whole Lord of the Rings thing. And if it would have succeeded, it would have been the largest, famous property to become an MMO in history first, like long before Final Fantasy XI came along or World of Warcraft. And that's another point I wanted to make. What made these games so successful is not only did their roots dig into sandbox open world as Dungeons and Dragons rule set and quality and imagination and freedom as possible, but they were also very, very, very precise in their targeted audience. They knew where they wanted to go, and they had to do it all without having a huge history in games. I know Meridian had some Meridian games before it was an MMO, and Ultima is set in the Ultima universe. But EverQuest and Asheron's Call in their time were far more popular and successful games than all the other games I've listed, and they had no background to go off of. They had no way to entice people to buy the game because, you remember EverQuest 1 and EverQuest 2 or Asheron's, mission back in the early 90s. Well, now it's an MMO. No, they didn't have that. They had to become successful based off of almost nothing. Based off of just, hey, it's an open world where you can do anything you want and level up a character and explore the world and find quests and missions and make friends and enemies and kill each other or not. And it really rung with the Dungeons and Dragons people, which was who the MMO genre was originally designed to appease. And as EverQuest and Asheron's Call continued to gain success, they did so because of several reasons. Not only were they continually updating the game, but unlike today's MMOs, which are all very, very theme park based, the old MMOs, the first generation as we'll call them, content lulls weren't really a thing because there wasn't really a goal to get to. The level caps were insanely high. So the game didn't start when you hit the highest level. The game was the whole game. It was about exploring, finding dungeons. Very little, if any of all, was instanced content. The developers were very, very active in being in the game. A good example, in Asheron's Call, you could be the bad guy if you wanted to. There was a patch cycle like 3 months in a row, because Asheron's Call had a patch every month, where all of a sudden out of nowhere all these shadow spires were coming out of the ground, and because the evil shadow creatures in the game were trying to resurrect their god, Belzeron, who wanted to just destroy the world. And if you were a player running around one of these giant shadow spires, sometimes it would teleport you in, and it would obviously be a developer playing as a shadow creature, but they would question you. And you could either be bad and help them and say, yeah, fuck the world, I just want to watch it burn, here's all the information you need. Or you could, say, like, oh, the light will prevail, eat my ass, shadow creature. And they would throw you out of the tower and you'd die. And that's something else I want to point out. And death in these games, while not permanent, was insanely punishing. You would lose items and gear, have to go back to your corpse. And a lot of times if your corpse would be in a spot you couldn't get to on your own, so you'd go searching in cities for more powerful players to help you get there. The world just felt so open and alive in these games because there weren't expansion zones where it was only profitable to be there and nowhere else. There weren't instance dungeons. So if you went into, I remember in Asheron's Call, I'm going to use Asheron's Call a lot, by the way, for examples, because I played the game very heavily from release for about 3 years. And if you found there was a dungeon that was found by a player called Black Spawn Den, and later became known BSD, but no one had found it before then. It was in this really dangerous area of the map called the Obsidian Plains, and not a lot of players were high enough level to be hunting there to get experience to level up. And he went in, and the spawn rate of these Tusker monsters that was in this dungeon was so high, it was so fast, he couldn't get more than 2 or 3 rooms in, and he had to go back into a town, tell people what he had discovered. He had written down the coordinates to where this dungeon was, and he took a party in there, and they kept trying to get to the bottom, deeper and deeper and deeper. And there was no raid loot that was going to drop. I mean, the creatures in there were high enough level, they were dropping really good loot anyway, and money, but they just wanted to see what was down there and discover the lore that was down in this Black Spawn Den. And shit like that was all organic, and it never happens in games anymore because everything, for the most part, has shifted to theme park, pay-to-win type stuff. Get to the last level of the game, that's where the game is, and there's nothing else after that. Once you finish the content, you unsubscribe until the next patch comes out. That was unheard of in games like EverQuest and Asheron's Call. The game literally was like a second life outside of your own. Alright, now let's fast forward for a bit. These games went on and were very successful for quite a large amount of time. In fact, EverQuest is still going to this day, the original. Asheron's Call, unfortunately, was sold off, and it is, as of about 1.5 years ago, is no longer in service. And there's a huge amount of people fighting to get the code so they can make their own emulated servers, but that's a completely different topic. Up to this point, no MMO had been made that was focused solely on a product or an IP that had already existed and was very popular up to this point. There was no Lord of the Rings online at this point. And so what a lot of people forget, the next game that came along, which I call second gen, the second generation of MMORPG, which vanilla World of Warcraft is in the second generation, but it is the game Final Fantasy XI. That game was brutal in its death penalty, far more brutal than Asheron's Call or EverQuest. It still was not instanced. It still had its roots dug deeply in the whole concept of what Dungeons and Dragons were. Exploration was still a huge thing, though it was far more party focused than Asheron's Call. EverQuest was more party focused than Asheron's Call, but Final Fantasy XI, in my opinion, was even more so party focused than even EverQuest was. You had to have a group after a certain point in the original game, and in the first expansion, Rise of the Zillard or something like that. But it was a very brutal game, but it did very, very well because it was a Final Fantasy had already been around for decades. It was a very established and beloved IP, and it was very successful for those reasons. I mean, if you go look back at it now, I mean, the game hasn't aged incredibly well, but at the time, it was also the first MMORPG that was available on console, on the PlayStation 2. So it took another step. It was we could see the genre, evolutionizing right before our eyes, and a lot of people were happy with the direction it was going. And I mean, it was a very acquired taste. A lot of people still preferred the faster-paced combat of Asheron's Call or the more established MMO community of EverQuest. But Final Fantasy XI in its own right was very, very, very successful. Now, I think a thing that made it successful, as I said before, it was still based in Dungeons and Dragons. It was still, it kept that RPG but freedom flavor, if you will, while at the same time trying new things. And Final Fantasy XI remained successful, and to this day they're probably getting a mobile port of the game. If it's not out already, I don't know. I haven't kept up with the game in a while. But Final Fantasy XI was released in 2002, and it was another step. It was the first real big second-gen MMORPG. And it was one of the first MMORPGs that actually already had an established fan base of the type of game, the IP that it was. So it's no surprise that it was very successful, even despite the fact that it's, how its account setup was a complete fucking nightmare and a mess. And, its performance wasn't always the greatest, but people to this day still adore Final Fantasy XI. So now we're going to move on to a little bit more of the meat. As I said earlier, World of Warcraft is considered, a second generation MMORPG. If you consider the first games before EverQuest and Asheron's Call, technically it's a third generation, but I count EverQuest and Asheron's Call as a first generation because they were the first fully 3D. You can move your camera around your whole character. All the objects in the world are 3D. So I count that as a first gen. And then Final Fantasy XI and World of Warcraft count as second gen. So World of Warcraft Vanilla, came out in 2004, late 2004. And it also, Warcraft had a huge following already, having, the RTS games, Warcraft 1 Orcs and Humans, Warcraft 2 and its expansion Tides of Darkness, and it was already a very well beloved franchise. So when players heard that Blizzard was making a game, an MMO in that category, people were ecstatic. A lot of people lost interest when they saw the cartoon nature of the graphics and things like that, but a lot of players got over that pretty quickly. I will be the first to admit, I know I give World of Warcraft and Blizzard a lot of shit, but I will be the first to admit that World of Warcraft Vanilla was a fucking masterpiece, and it took what the other MMOs had done before and put a new spin on it, and the genre, evolution sped up dramatically because of the risks that development team took. And even Blizzard themselves had no idea how successful the game would be. And here's where I think the key is. World of Warcraft was still designed with very much freedom, exploration, character customization, and not having a real huge overarching story that everyone had to follow, and targeting the Dungeons and Dragons player base, the MMO genre player base in mind when they created Vanilla World of Warcraft. There was a lot of freedom in World of Warcraft. There were areas you were too dangerous to go to. The game didn't start at end game. Most people didn't even realize that Molten Core, like the whole raid scene, was even a thing until they were level capped and go, oh wow, I'm not done with the game? It was insane because it took people a long time to get to level 60 initially. So World of Warcraft vanilla was still very much like EverQuest, very much like Asheron's Call and Final Fantasy XI, in that there was a lot of shit you could do solo. But you needed groups for certain areas and certain monsters to take them down. It was impossible to do so many things alone. The world was very, very explorable. Final Fantasy XI and World of Warcraft, when you compare them, one backdraw I think they took with those two games, with the second generation, one misstep, the first misstep I'm going to point out, is that Final Fantasy XI and World of Warcraft were the first 3D MMORPG games that put hidden walls in the game that you couldn't pass through. Granted, like in Asheron's Call, if you ran too far out into the middle of the ocean, you would hit an invisible wall, but that doesn't really count because there was no underwater in that game. So, you can't run across the depths of the ocean. That's physically impossible. But other than that, in EverQuest and in Asheron's Call, you could pretty much go wherever you saw. You would run there and get there and try to climb mountains and find ways up and find, But Final Fantasy XI, there were invisible walls, or they made every area just completely enclosed by mountains or something that you could not climb. And World of Warcraft did the same thing. But World of Warcraft was nowhere as egregious as Final Fantasy XI in that regard. But let's move on. But vanilla World of Warcraft still was targeting a very specific group of people, and to Blizzard it was just icing on the cake that they were able to get so many more players so quickly, to the point that in the first month of release they were having server problems because they had to stop shipping the game because they just couldn't accommodate for how many people wanted to play. And it was partly due to the success of games like Asheron's Call and EverQuest that it became so popular. Because as MMOs in their initial days were targeting the Dungeons and Dragons and a very specific group of people, other people try the game. Other people try the game and they fell in love with EverQuest. They fell in love with Asheron's Call. And so when they heard World of Warcraft was coming out, they wanted to play that too. But that's something that we'll get into in the next part of the series. Is in the initial stages of World of Warcraft, people who had never played an MMO and started to play World of Warcraft had to adapt to the game, had to adapt to the rule set, much in the same way a new player of Dungeons and Dragons would have to adapt, and would have to, I've got to figure out, how this works. The game's not going to bend backwards for me. I've got to figure out, the rules of the game, and I've got to adapt, which is something that has completely gone away in modern MMOs. Developers cater to the least common denominator, and the most common denominator. They cater to whatever's going to get the most amount of money and the most amount of people. But again, we're going to go into that in the next part of the series. So vanilla World of Warcraft, very successful, revolutionized the genre, was a very positive thing for the genre, and really more than even EverQuest or Asheron's Call could have hoped to have ever done in their lifespan. Took the MMORPG genre to the main stage, the world stage of gaming, where all of a sudden people were lifting an eyebrow like, wow, this is fucking cool. And as World of Warcraft's success continued to grow, I felt, even all during vanilla, Blizzard, had their head on straight. They had a very open world with, open world PvP, role-playing dedicated servers, which, wasn't a new thing. I mean, I'm pretty sure EverQuest had role-playing dedicated servers, and I know that Asheron's Call had one PvP server. But the sheer amount of people that were playing World of Warcraft was unheard of at that point, and put Asheron's Call and EverQuest numbers to fucking shame. I mean, those developers were like, how the fuck did they do this? And even the vast majority of players that hit level cap in World of Warcraft, never raided, never did Molten Core or Blackwing Lair or Zul'Gurub or any of those. Zul'Gurub was a little more popular because it was a little easier and more accessible to players, but nobody who bought World of Warcraft on day one bought it in the mindset of, I have to buy this game and get to the highest level as fast as possible so that I can start actually enjoying and playing the game. People still looked at an MMO as an open world adventure, and that your level will just get higher as you play, and you'll get more powerful. But the game itself, the journey was what was important, not the end. Because people were so used to EverQuest and Assurance Call there was no end. There was no content lull where you're waiting for the next raid or the next dungeon. The worlds were so massive, you would just search for the new dungeons and the new raids. You'd have to search and talk to NPCs in towns to even find quests. There were no exclamation points or there was no hand-holding in those games. And World of Warcraft tried to be a little more accessible to newer players, which I don't think was a bad thing. But as we'll see as my series goes on, how it became a very bad thing. The hand-holding and the babysitting hit ridiculous levels. But World of Warcraft continued to be successful and continued to have its roots in Dungeons and Dragons, continued to have the accessibility and at the same time the huge massive world in its first expansion, the Burning Crusade. And though it was dwindling, it was still, very, very much an MMORPG in Wrath of the Lich King. However, by this point, by Burning Crusade and Wrath of the Lich King, World of Warcraft had hit its peak. It, had 12 million players, a ridiculous amount of support. It was the best MMORPG ever created at that point. It was the undisputed champion, and no one could argue that. Blizzard had done something great, had made a masterpiece. But then the pieces started to fall apart. And I'm not going into how WoW sucks now, in my opinion, because I believe it does, or how it failed. What I'm talking about is what its success has done to the genre. And as its success peaked, we started to see the backlash and how everything began to fall apart with not Blizzard, but with everyone who wanted a piece of the pie. Everyone who wanted, all the developers and all the companies who had the dollar signs in their eyes and wanted to take advantage of what WoW's success was, because WoW's success was very much rooted in Dungeons and Dragons, in appealing to a very specific audience, in taking what worked well in Assurance Call and EverQuest and building on that, and in Final Fantasy XI. And they just saw one big dollar sign and a way to try to get a piece of that money pie. And so guys, we're going to go into that in the next video in the series. I know it's dragged out a little bit, but I felt we needed a bit of a history lesson for me to really get my point across in the next series, which will come out later this week. Have how World of Warcraft's success has derailed the MMORPG genre. So tune in later this week to part 2 of this series. Thank you guys for following and for watching. Make sure if you're new and you like the video so far, you like the series so far, comment, rate it, thumbs up, thumbs down if you didn't like it, and go fuck yourself. Hit the subscribe button and the little bell if you liked it. Follow me on Twitch and Twitter, and keep it real, guys, as always, and I'll be back real soon with part 2.